Hello everyone, my name is Katerina. Welcome to another video on my YouTube channel. Since it's March, I'm going to be making few flower spring cards to get us into the spring mood, and I'm going to be using stamps for all of these cards. I haven't been using stamps much recently, simply because I never know if they are interesting for you. You see, I don't use the latest stamps, and often they are no longer available. Therefore, I'm always unsure if I should release them. My card's supposed to be more like an inspiration or a template that you can do with other stamps as well. And I would really appreciate it if you let me know in the comments if you prefer cards with stamps or without stamps like I did in my previous video. And also, do you mind if I'm using all the stamps? Because that's the case for all the stamps I'm using this month. All stamps are from Clearly Besotted. They are pretty much identical, just with different flowers. And the first stamp set that I'm using in this video is called Spring Tulips. There are two stamps with tulips in this stamp set, and I'm going to be using the one with the row of tulips. The other one I will use some other time. And while the stamp sets are really nice, I'm a huge fan of flower stamp sets from Clearly Besotted. The main two parts of these cards are the alcohol markers from Altenew. I bought these like 2 years ago, and while I use them on few cards already, I never use them in a video. So this is kind of a premiere. And the second part of this card is creating a border or a frame using dies, more specifically rectangle dies. I often use this kind of a frame when I die cut the main image, like in this case a flower, and I want to cover up especially the bottom part of the die cut, so it looks more neat. I started by stamping the tulips. The ink I'm using here is the Gina K Amalgam ink. This ink works very well with alcohol markers. Alternative would be the Memento Tuxedo Black. The cardstock I'm using here is the Canson XL Mixed Media. I really like the texture on this cardstock and I like to use it with these markers. However, I'm not an expert when it comes to the cardstock and alcohol markers, so use whatever cardstock you like using with these markers. Due to the texture of the cardstock, I had to restamp, therefore I'm using here the Mini Misty stamping tool, but you can use an acrylic block and maybe a smoother cardstock. Next, I started coloring. I picked 2 shades of red and 2 shades of green. For the reds, I used the R217 and R206 markers, and for the greens, I used G702 and G715. I'm not the best when it comes to shading. I did here what I always do. I started at the bottom of the petals and the leaves using the darker shade. For the smaller petals, I only used the dark shade. And for the top, I used the lighter shade. When applying the lighter shade, I started from the darker shade, blending it together. The coloring is super simple, so I will speed it up a bit. And let's talk about the markers. I really like these markers. I mentioned this when I showed them in my haul video. When I started card making, I felt like everyone was using the Copic markers. The problem with Copic markers is that they are expensive. And even though I would have loved to give Copics a try, I could not justify the price. I mean, I could not justify the price for the regular Misty, which for me is more valuable product. At that time, there were some alternatives, but the good thing about the Copics is that they have a brush tip, which some of these alternatives didn't have. These days, you can find alternatives to Copics with a brush tip. I almost bought the Shin hand markers, but I just did not know which colors or more specifically which shades to buy. So you can imagine how excited I was when Altenew released their markers in their typical way. They release a bundle of complementary shades, which takes the guessing work from you. Plus, they are not that expensive. It took me a while to purchase those, but I'm so happy I did. I recently bought 2 more packs, so I have altogether 6 color packs with 4 different shades each: reds, greens, blues, purples, yellows, and grays. And even though I mostly use watercolor mediums or pencils, I really enjoy using these markers. They are perfect when you need to do a quick coloring. I finished the coloring and then was time to do some die cutting. I die cut the tulips. I created 2 of the die cuts, and I also took 2 rectangular dies. Those are the stitched rectangular dies from Create a Smile, and I used them to die cut a border or more like a frame. If you watched my previous videos, you might be asking where's the die cutting machine from. I mentioned I don't have a die cutting machine at the moment. Well, I still don't have a die cutting machine. This video and the next one I filmed last year, but because I only had a limited mobile internet throughout the whole spring, I wasn't able to upload them. Originally, I wasn't going to use dies for the tulips, but I knew I will not have a die cutting machine for a while, so I used dies for every card I made. Anyways, next I decided I wanted to do something with the background. This is completely optional. You can leave it white and just adhere it to the panel. To color the background, I took my distress inks, blue and green colors, and I created a sky and grass background. For the blues, I used Salty Ocean and Tablet Glass, and for the greens, I used Mown Lawn. I applied the inks directly onto a card base, which didn't give me the smoothest results. If you want that, then it's better to use a cardstock that is more suited for ink blending. I really like to use a hot press watercolor cardstock or Canson XL cardstock, the mixed media or watercolor. I placed 3 pieces of post-it tape onto the card base, first not to get ink onto the back of the card base, but also to secure it, which created a nice border. I will be placing the die cut frame over it, so you won't see it anyway, but the border does look nice. I applied the ink using a blending tool that I bought in something like a euro or dollar store. I still prefer using the tools from Tim Holtz, but this is a great option as well. I like to use this tool on a cardstock that is not the best for blending inks. And while I had the distress inks out, I also applied the inks onto the frame. I didn't want the frame to be white, so I used the Mown Lawn and Forest Moss distress inks and I applied it onto the frame. For the frame, I used the Canson XL Mixed Media cardstock. You could use a colored cardstock for the frame as well, but I like that the colors match the background. I first applied the lighter green across the whole frame. I used a piece of post-it tape on my fingers so I don't mess it up. And then I used the darker green on the edges, blending it with the lighter green. I think it just looks more interesting. Before adhering the pieces onto the card base, I stamped a sentiment. I'm making a birthday card, so I'm using a happy birthday sentiment. It's from another stamp set from Clearly Besotted. This stamp set is also not available anymore, which is quite annoying. I understand the flower stamp sets, but why not to keep the sentiment stamp set? I think they never get old. I stamped the sentiment in the top middle section directly onto the card base. Just as with the tulips, I'm using the Mini Misty stamping tool and the ink from Gina K. And now I finally can assemble all the die cut pieces. I attached a double-sided foam tape onto the back of the die cuts. I did this off camera as it's pretty boring in my opinion. And I attached first the frame onto the card base. One important thing, when you are attaching the tape on the bottom of the frame, leave a little bit of space to tuck in the die cut flowers or whatever image you are using. The reason the frame is one of the main components of this card is because it brings the whole thing together. As I said, I like to use frames like these to cover the bottom part of the die cuts. While it wouldn't look ugly if I didn't use the frame, I think it just makes it more neater, especially in this case. I will show you another example of a frame like this in a bit. I also adhere the tulips. The stems I tucked in behind the frame, and the tulips that are on the left and right side, I did not tuck them in, I left them outside of the frame. I think this way it looks way better. To finish up the card, I used a few clear drops in 2 sizes. I think they are from Pretty Pink Posh, and I scattered 3 of them across the panel. Before I adhere them, I first try to figure out the best placement, and then I use the Glossy Accents glue from Ranger. Normally, I use the multi-medium matte adhesive also from Ranger, but I thought since the embellishments are clear, having a glossy glue is a good idea. Is there a difference? I don't really know. This is more like my brain at work. All I know is that I really need to buy a new bottle of Glossy Accents because this one is really old. And the card is done. I really like the finished card. I enjoy using the Altenew markers, and I think the frame just fits. Talking about the frame, here is another card with the same idea. I had this stamp set with octopus floating in the water. I created a galaxy background, but when I went to adhere the die cut onto the background, at the bottom of the die cut, it just looked weird. So I came with the idea of a frame to cover it up. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did and would like to help out my channel, then click on the like button and subscribe if you haven't done so already. If you would like to see more cards where I use stamps and different coloring mediums, then click on the playlist that is on your screens now. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.